So, ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome you here to the Royal Society? I'm Martin Polyakov. I'm the Foreign Secretary of the Society. And before I begin the formal speech, there are a couple of quite important things to say to you. First of all, this lecture is going to be webcast live. So it is particularly important that you switch off your mobile phone, or your indiscretion when it rings will be broadcast to the world. And so now I would like to welcome the lecturer, Roger Highfield. He is the Royal Society Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar lecturer. And his lecture, as you can see, is entitled Heroes of Science. Roger Highfield was born in Wales and was raised in North London and became the first person to bounce a neutron off a soap bubble during his DPhil in physical chemistry, which was conducted partly at the University of Oxford and partly at the Institut Langevin in Grenoble. He was the science editor of the Daily Telegraph for 2 decades, an editor of New Scientist from 2008 to 2011, and currently is Director of External Affairs at the Science Museum Group. And he's also very well known here in the Society as the founder of our annual Scientists Meet the Media party. So this particularly distinguished action. He has written and co-authored 7 popular books on science, 2 of which have been bestsellers, including Dolly, The Science of Harry Potter, and Can Reindeers Fly? The Science of Christmas. It's really useful. I've given several of those as Christmas presents. And The Private Lives of Albert Einstein. He's also had thousands of articles published in newspapers and magazines. The Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar lecture is given on a subject relating to the social function of science, the philosophy of science, or the history of science. Dr. Roger Highfield was awarded the Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar lecture in recognition of his outstanding work on scientific journalism and popular science writing. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to present to you Dr. Roger Highfield.
Thank you, Martin. Cheers. Thank you very much, Martin. Incredible honor to be here. So let's go looking for heroes. Now, we get many insights from fiction. There are action heroes, anti-heroes, Byronic heroes, romantic heroes, folk heroes, reluctant heroes, superheroes, local heroes, and of course those poor old tragic heroes too. And there are lots of definitions as well. But one simple and for me relevant way to find heroic scientist is to pick an individual who's been lionized by Hollywood. So we've got Marie Curie, the first person honored with 2 Nobel Prizes. Her radioactive research was immortalized in this 1943 movie written by Aldous Huxley. Then there's Sir Isaac Newton, the last of the magicians and the first of the scientists. Now, this depiction by Harpo Marx of Newton in the 1957 Irwin Allen film, The Story of Mankind, is the favorite of a former Royal Society president, Lord Rees. And interestingly, I heard that there's going to be a new depiction of Newton as the sleuthing head of the Royal Mint, under development by the director who gave the world The Mummy 3 and the executive producer of Rocky. So arise, Sir Isaac Newton, special detective. Then, of course, there's Albert Einstein. Now, that's the popular hero. I actually prefer the scientific hero. This, for me, is the real Einstein, even though the shaggy-haired old man in Princeton still tends to be the inspiration for novels, films, plays, and works of music. And in fact, according to Variety, a biography I wrote with Paul Carter is racing against Walter Isaacson's for a new Einstein biopic, although we're all still waiting for that fresh, young movie Einstein to appear. There's Darwin, who's been immortalized in the movie Creation. And finally, we've got Yes, the president of the Royal Society, Sir Paul Nurse, the Nobelist, the master of both the cell cycle and the motorcycle. Now, so far, there are no plans for a movie, but I've already started to think about casting. Now, let me outline why science needs heroes. The short answer is that it needs them for the same reason that Hollywood does. The long-winded version goes like this. One aspect of being human is that we adore stories. But is the story of the hero the truth? No. Only one person knows the truth, and he, capital H, doesn't exist, or she, capital S. The rest of us mere mortals are faced with two kinds of truth. At one extreme, you've got egregious oversimplifications, such as Einstein invented the atomic bomb. And at the other extreme, you've got the inconvenient truth, those hideously complicated webs of influence behind an advance from the knowledge and technology of the day to an upbringing, a mentor, and so on. Now, the latter views are adored by scholars who get a thrill from showing that the earlier stabs at revealing the realities of scientific advance were incomplete based on flawed assumptions and so on and so forth. What's unfortunate, I think, is that this view can give the impression that science is carried out by a collectivist ant army, which is exploring the infinite parameter space of experiments or theory where discovery is inevitable and individual endeavor counts for little. Now, in between these extremes is a convenient truth, one that's got a reasonable correspondence with reality. Now, here it's the historians of science who, to their credit, are best placed to come up with a new framework or a reference for an old problem, providing a more nuanced but a more digestible view of a heroic tale. And the public needs the convenient truth if they're to appreciate and understand science. Now, I've spent decades working with audiences of millions of people, and I know that if we abandon heroes, we actually make science boring and insipid. And we need science to inspire more than ever before, because through technology, it's the most powerful force on culture today. So for the sake of a functioning democracy, we need heroes. Now, you're going to complain that this distorts our picture of the way that science is done. It does. But the public is sophisticated. They know that real life is more complicated than a simple heroic story. You're going to complain that this is tantamount to telling lies. Now, I don't want anyone to be misled. I want heroic stories to contain the gist of the truth. But unless you're omniscient and not dependent on the usual flawed, subjective, and partial information in the historic record, and unless your audience is infinitely patient and receptive, even the most diligent historian can never present the whole truth. Now, you're going to complain this is cynical. And all I'm saying is that we need heroes because the public are a bit slow on the uptake. Now, I really don't believe that. I believe in talking to people in a language they understand and in a way that ensures they're going to be receptive. We need a lingua franca. We need convenient truths that can convey the kernel of science without recourse to calculus, dense descriptions, and exhaustive emphasis on the collective aspects of scientific discovery. So the public needs heroes for the same reason they need metaphors. And let's face it, most scientists are pretty terrible at PR, and they need all the help they can get. So we should reinstate our heroes, and I'm also going to give you some new kinds of heroes, heroes that are not even made of flesh and blood. Now, hero worship supposedly originates with the ancient Greeks, who knew that a memorable story needed a hero. Their characters who, in the face of adversity, from a position of weakness, display courage, the will for self-sacrifice for some greater good. Now, science is yet another human endeavor and full of these sorts of stories. Let's take the example of J.B.S. Haldane, popularizer, geneticist, Marxist, World War I veteran, and who perforated his eardrums in decompression chamber experiments. And as he cheerily stated in his book, What is Life? Although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment. Another heroic self-experimenter is Barry Marshall, who drank a Petri dish of Helicobacter pylori bacterium to show the link with ulcers. He got stomachache, nausea, vomiting, and halitosis, but he did prove Koch's postulates. There are those who put themselves in danger to advance knowledge, such as Anira Conter, the Sierra Leonean doctor who cut death rates from Lassa fever, saving thousands of lives until he himself succumbed to the virus in 2004. They include those who suffer ideologically, for example, at the hands of Lysenko, the director of the Soviet Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. With Stalin's approval, geneticists were executed or sent to labor camps. There were the German scientists who defended Jewish colleagues in the 30s, and there are American climate scientists who suffer harassment today. But the quest to find out how the universe works is heroic in its own right. Now, Plato visualized this quest for the truth as a kind of intellectual relay race, where one heroic scholar passes the torch of genius to another. And as the historian of science, Patricia Farah, points out, this romantic image persisted. As a result, the history of science came to be taught as a heroic saga in which a few far-seeing male geniuses overcame the petty opposition of lesser minds to establish truths. And that brings me to today's historians of science. Now, of course, they are fascinated by heroes. You've got Frank James on Faraday, Ludmila Jordanova on Edward Jenner. There are armies working on Darwin, Newton, and Einstein, but they do disapprove of how heroic accounts of the past tend to elevate a few brilliant men into geniuses, but consign the rest, including pretty much all women out there, to oblivion. Now, this, according to Farah, converts people into the intellectual equivalent of mythical gods. They're endowed with superhuman brains, they waft above worldly affairs, they think great thoughts. John Waller, in his book Fabulous Science, says that many popular portraits of scientific heroes are just romantic inventions about men who before their time valiantly struggled to vault ignorant opposition before achieving scientific immortality. They underplay the crucially important contributions of the many, and the history of science has been distorted by individuals seeking to glorify disciplines and nations, by famous scientists who are only too happy to steal the credit for another's work. Discovery, he says, is a multi-participant event, not a story of lone heroes or eureka moments. And real life doesn't follow some romantic, linear, heroic highway to the truth. It's more like a meandering, overgrown path. Now, I agree with this. I know reality is more complicated. The problem is it's always more complicated. Now, unsurprisingly, academics are given short shrift to pop history of science books. Waller complains, quite rightly, that they follow a familiar formula. You've got the hero arriving at a new idea, that's Act 1. He suffers the wrath of jealousy, conservatism, clerical bigotry, that's Act 2. Then he's triumphantly vindicated in Act 3. Now, in 2002, in the aftermath of Darvis-Obel's Longitude, the historian David Philip Miller published an essay review, and it had a rather wonderful headline. Now, I don't disagree with the historians. They're absolutely right. Scientists are engaged in a huge cooperative venture. Actually, it is an adventure, one in which they build on the hard work of their predecessors and their peers and their competitors. And you can even argue that there seems to be a trend at work that's threatening heroes, the rise of big science. We have 10,000 scientists, half of the world's particle physicists, going to CERN in Geneva. We've got members of the International Human Genome Consortium, sequencing consortium, came from a huge array of institutions worldwide. A few weeks ago, we had the follow-up analysis of the genome from the ENCODE consortium, and that had more than 440 scientists. In fact, we even celebrated the fruits of this collaboration with key members, the journal Nature, and an aerial silk dance, which you can see here, in the Science Museum. And even mathematics, which is traditionally a very lonesome profession, is becoming more collaborative thanks to Sir Tim Gowers and his Polymath project. Now, because of the rise of collaborative science and the efforts of historians, are heroes doomed to go extinct? I really hope not, because they've got a critical role to play in popularization. The fact that we're still recounting Homer's Iliad or Beowulf shows you the power of storytelling. And it shows you the attraction of heroes, whether of Odysseus or the slayer of the monster Grendel. Now, psychologists have long been fascinated by the human predilection for narrative. There was a classic study in 1944 by Fritz Heider and Mary Ann Simmel in which people were shown an animation of a pair of triangles and a circle moving around a square. The participants told elaborate stories about the circle and the little triangle being in love. The big bad grey triangle trying to steal away the circle, the blue triangle fighting back, yelling to his love to escape, and how they embraced and lived happily ever after. Now, since then, we've got brain scan studies by Chris-Anuta Frith and Francesca Happe that showed activation in the temporoparietal junction of medial prefrontal cortex during these scenarios. Now, what's remarkable is that the same networks are engaged when we see these abstract moving shapes than when we're thinking about the mental states of others. We've got machinery in our heads to detect faces and discern emotions, to find patterns, those linked with survival and our ability to pass on our genes. There's a fundamental human predilection to make characters and narratives out of whatever we see in the world around us, to see agency in dark shadows and messages in the stars. In these patterns and coincidences, we find gods and we find heroes too. And for that reason, I suspect hero worship is as old as the human brain. Now, you can speculate that as our ancestors evolved to live in groups, they told stories to make sense of increasingly complex social lives. This propensity to produce a cartoon of real life, the need to know highlights, predisposes us to see that pattern known as a hero, sometimes, unfortunately, when there's no hero at all. The stories that create heroes are important to cement reputations. And as I pointed out in my last book with Martin Nowak of Harvard, this is crucial for the evolution of cooperation through a mechanism called indirect reciprocity. Now, this is the most straightforward, there is the most straightforward mechanism for the evolution of cooperation known as direct reciprocity, which is basically if I scratch your back, you scratch mine. The indirect version says that if I scratch your back, someone else will scratch mine. And it depends crucially on language and on reputation. We cooperate with people who have a great reputation. As David Haig of Harvard put it, for direct reciprocity, you need a face. For indirect reciprocity, you need a name. And what better name than that of a hero? So I agree the reality of a story of a scientific development is always complicated, more complicated than these stories suggest, and we're bound to be told that, if only to emphasize the value of scholarship. But we've got to be pragmatic when we deal with general audiences. So it's not the choice between telling people the real story behind a breakthrough and telling a heroic tale. When we're selling the magic of science, we need to accept the most powerful way is through stories. Now, scientists routinely use metaphors to communicate complex ideas. And by the same token, you need heroic characters as metaphors to convey the broad sweep of history. Now, the limitations of these cartoons are well known. Some are more fun than informative, and some are quite elaborate. There's the one about the Higgs, based around Margaret Thatcher walking through a room full of Tory party workers. Now, I'm not going to repeat this again, save to say that whenever I've used this idea, it's often made people puzzled, only in a different way from before. If you pick at any metaphor, it tends to break down. Even so, I think scientists are grateful for anything if it can just help get over the gist of what they do to a general audience. And that, for the same reason, is why we need heroes. So let's take the biggest science story of the year, the discovery of the Higgs at the Large Hadron Collider. We found the last missing cornerstone of the Standard Model, said Rolf Dieter Hoyer, CERN's Director General. The problem is, of course, that most people have no idea what the Standard Model is. You can bill this remarkable discovery as the beginning of a long journey to investigate an interesting particle, or that it opens up new areas to explore that could explain some of the biggest unanswered questions. But it's also a very human story. It's an intrepid tale of the visionary theorist, well, one of them at least, I know there was a group, and that's Peter Higgs. This story is really powerful. The King's College theoretician John Ellis mused at an SDFC event recently that it could inspire a generation in the same way that the Apollo adventure did in the 60s. And it really is inspiring. You've got the incredible tale of how a young man proposed this particle and 5 decades later had his profound insights confirmed by a £6 billion machine and an army of scientists and engineers. Even better, Higgs is so shy and retiring that he makes a very winningly reluctant hero. Now, scientists have known the value of heroes for centuries. Newton's ideas were marketed by John Theophilus Desaguliers, a priest and member of the Royal Society who was Newton's assistant. Then there were the ideas about inclusive fitness, the basis of the selfish gene propounded by Bill Hamilton in two slightly impenetrable papers in the Journal of Theoretical Biology in '64. It would actually take two formidable, brilliant popularizers, E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins, to bring Hamilton's ideas to life. However, I should add that they recently fell out very badly over Wilson's re-evaluation of inclusive fitness, published with my co-author, Martin Novak, in Nature. Now, the story of general relativity is another example where a scientist played a key role, both in popularization and in confirmation. Sir Arthur Eddington led the 1919 eclipse expedition that confirmed the bending of light predicted by Einstein. That's according to one heroic account. Eddington was Einstein's bulldog. He championed the Germans' ideas and in England fiercely defensive of Newton. Now, it's been joked that Eddington, like Simon Cowell, made Einstein a star, and he was just as ruthless. John Waller points out that Eddington's evidence was hardly conclusive. The scientific establishment loves to celebrate heroes. Since '96, the American Chemical Society has run its Heroes of Chemistry program. Now, we all know here that there can be no more than 3 heroes every year in medicine and physics and chemistry. In no case may a prize amount be divided between more than 3 persons, says the statutes of the Nobel Foundation. That's right, isn't it, Tim? So scientists worship their heroes with colloquia and speeches. They name things after them. They do it with medals, like the Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar lecture. Thank you very much, Royal Society. Does the Society collect heroes or make them? Well, they actually do both, because next month it's holding an editathon to improve Wikipedia entries about women in science. Yes, the Royal Society is setting up a heroin factory. Like journalists, scientists shape the facts to tell a good story. Now, one supposed hero of science is the German chemist Friedrich Verla, who's credited with the chemical synthesis of urea that disproved vitalism. Now, in a letter in 1828, he wrote, "I can no longer, as it were, hold back my chemical urine. I must tell you that I can make urea without needing a kidney." Now, at that time, it was thought that organic substances could only be created with the help of a vital force, some kind of spirit or whatever. And a few years later, in September 1837, we had the chemist Justus Liebig telling the British Association for the Advancement of Science in Liverpool about Vola's work and how a new era in science has commenced. If you wind forward a few years, and by 1937, you get Vola being depicted as a young scientist who toiled in the sacred temple of his laboratory to discredit the mysterious vital force in a popular history written by the chemist Bernard Jaffe. Now, in fact, if you look at the record, you find there's few known contemporary accounts of the immediate reaction to Verla's feat. In fact, any excitement there was at the time was because the synthesis marked an example of isomerism and the transformation of a salt-like compound into one that lacked the properties of salt. And what's really important is that even the claim that it ended vitalism was dubious. You know, his starting materials were all derived from organic materials. So his portrayal as the anti-vitalism hero is what Peter Ramberg, the historian, rightly calls the Verla myth. Now, I think all of this would really matter if we thought the public swallowed the cartoon view of the hero hook, line, and sinker. But they're really not that naive. And of course, heroes always emphasize that their success relies on the efforts of others. You've got sobbing Oscar winners who paid tribute to their parents, their spouses, their muses, and their therapists. In the Paralympics, the gold medalists thanked families, sponsors, trainers, that friend who paid for the driving lessons, sports psychologists, sports scientists, and so on. Yet we still love to see them on the podium. We all know that it took something like 400,000 people and 5% of the American government's entire budget to allow Neil Armstrong to take that one small step. Yet Barack Obama had no hesitation in calling Armstrong among the greatest of American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time. Armstrong himself endlessly downplayed that one small step, and that's going to be something that will be remembered for millennia. And he gave this wonderful self-portrait a few years ago. I am, and ever will be, a white socks, pocket protector, nerdy engineer, born under the second law of thermodynamics, steeped in steam tables, in love with free body diagrams, transformed by Laplace, and propelled by compressible flow. He was only doing his job. And of course, that's the kind of hero we all love best. So when the historians complain that we neglect that army of giants on whose shoulders breakthroughs rest, and that we oversimplify, and that we overstate the significance of an individual, I totally agree. It's a real shame. But bearing a general audience in mind, it would be a much bigger shame if we flattened the significance of the likes of Newton and Darwin. And do we really want to underplay how a 26-year-old Einstein wrote 4 papers in his Annus Mirabilis that forever changed our views on space and time and matter? So far I've tried to stress that heroes are critical if we're to inspire the public and, with luck, the next generation. So who do the public think are the heroes of science? Well, we've got, of course, the best-known living scientist on the planet, Stephen Hawking, author of the most popular science book on the planet, brilliant work fusing quantum mechanics, general relativity, and an amazing personal story. I've never heard him complain once about his predicament. You've got the greatest living Englishman. So, well, that's in my view anyway. Sir David Attenborough, love David Attenborough, who's enthralled millions with his wildlife programs. You've got James Lovelock, who's a rare example of an independent scientist who's been hugely influential. And actually, that's why the Science Museum is acquiring his collection. There's Marie Curie. Now, in a poll I organized for New Scientist, when I edited it, she was voted, of course, the greatest female scientist of all time. There's Einstein, of course, and there's the lovely Brian Cox. And I just want to say, let's not forget that brilliant Caltech theoretical physicist who is famous for his lack of social skills, his poorly developed sense of humor, and his diminished sense of empathy. Now, he's actually responsible also for a new definition of engineers, the Oompa Loompas of science. Now, with the rest of the Big Bang Theory cast, he's helped to make geek chic, and he's fueled interest in physics among teenagers. I think what's fascinating for me is that I think with the exception of Curie, Hawking, and Einstein, quite a few of these popular scientific heroes are regarded a little bit sniffily by other scientists. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think one of the main ones is not so much to do with the shortcomings of these popular heroes or the usual envy, but an understandable frustration that so many more deserve recognition. It's people like Barbara McClintock, whose work on jumping genes was revolutionary. You know, the first scientists to correctly speculate on the concept of epigenetics. And before we even had the double helix, Paul Dirac, who gave us antimatter, who despite the best efforts of Graham Farmiloe, who's over there, is still not really recognized for what he was, Britain's answer to Albert Einstein. So if we could ask Einstein about his heroes, I'm sure he would have singled out James Clerk Maxwell. Maxwell, said Einstein, had the most profound insight since Newton. His portrait even hung over Einstein's fireplace in Princeton. Now, if that isn't a hero, I don't know what is, really. You've got people like Barry Blumberg, who gave us the hepatitis B vaccine, Lynn Margulis, and symbiosis, and so forth. There's really no shortage of scientists who deserve a bigger profile among the public. So now I just want to move on to another kind of hero, which I think has been neglected in discussions. I'm not talking about hidden heroes, whether those restriction enzymes, Bayesian statistics, PCR, or all those scientific innovations that exert an extraordinary indirect effect on everyday life. I'm actually thinking of the discussions more than a decade ago that led to the Science Museum's greatest hits of science, engineering, and technology, our Making of the Modern World Gallery. The then director, Sir Neil Cousins, said museum objects themselves are heroes. And I think he had a really interesting point. When you look at the Science Museum's collection, it's very different in one general, I'm being a bit generalist here, respect from, say, the V&A and the British Museum. While they have many objects of intrinsic beauty, we tend to collect objects because they tell amazing and heroic stories of human ingenuity. We've got the Apollo 10 command module. Now, for me, that symbolizes the greatest story ever, when humankind slipped the bounds of their home world. Now, when I see this tarnished plastic cone, it's actually a honeycomb of hand-injected phenolic resin. I'm transported back to when I wore short trousers and I gazed up to the moon in wonder, just knowing that astronauts are about to walk on it. Stafford, Young, and Cernan traveled around the moon in May 1969 in this unprepossessing thing, and they achieved the highest speeds ever in a manned vehicle. Inside this cramped womb, and it really is tiny when you look inside it, they traveled to the farthest point astronauts had ever strayed from their home. And when I look at the Apollo 10 command module, I'm really awestruck because here we've got a human adventure that actually seems more heroic today in 2012 than it did in '69. And in fact, every time I walk past it, I've got this irresistible urge to climb inside, but you can't because there's a there must be a shield there to stop hero worshippers like me losing their minds. Okay, another heroic object in the collection is the model of the double helix unveiled by Watson and Crick in '53. Now, we all know that the elucidation of that structure also depended on Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins, Raymond Gosselin, Alexander Stokes, Herbert Wilson, and Erwin Chargaff, and probably others too. And in a sense, that's why I think the double helix is a more truthful hero than perhaps the double act of Watson and Crick. The helix tells us what happened when physics, in the guise of X-ray crystallography, met biology and mingled to give the world molecular biology. The double helix tells us another story, another nail in the coffin of vitalism, when Watson was led to remark that life is simply a matter of chemistry. The helix also tells you about selling science. This model was constructed for a photo opportunity, to give the protagonist something tangible to stand next to. And most of all, the model of the double helix tells us the story of heredity and reproduction, the greatest story ever, one that stretches back 4 billion years to the origins of life on Earth. Now, here's a very unremarkable looking hero. This is James Lovelock's electron capture detector, which he invented in 1956 to detect atoms and molecules in a gas. And it's another piece of kit that I'm glad to say we've acquired in the Science Museum back in 1977. It remains among one of the most sensitive of chemical analytical methods, and it revealed that pesticide residues are ubiquitous. And in the summer of 1967, Lovelock used it to show that the supposedly clean air blowing off the Atlantic onto the west coast of Ireland contains CFCs, which of course we all now know cause ozone depletion. So this rather unremarkable looking instrument is really heroic, because I think along with Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, it really helped to kickstart the environmental movement. And yes, of course, I had to mention another great obvious heroic object, the Large Hadron Collider. Now, look, this is heroic by any measure. The biggest machine on the planet, the fastest racetrack. It's got the emptiest space on the solar system. It's the hottest spot in the galaxy. It happens to be one of the coldest spots, too, colder than outer space. Now, given that it's as big as a circle line, and it's going to be in use for many years yet, we're not going to be able to put it in the Science Museum, but we do plan to celebrate this heroic feat of engineering in an exhibition next year. And I'm endlessly reminded by the people I meet that these objects inspire us just as much as the traditional scientific hero or that great teacher. I met a few weeks ago the mathematician and master of cellular automata, Stephen Wolfram, who told me that when he was under the age of 3, he spent the whole summer badgering his parents to visit the Science Museum, and he visited the Science Museum every day. Stephen Hawking calls the museum one of his favorite places because it introduces young people to the wonder of discovery. Now, the idea that objects are heroes in that great story of modern progress can be seen when Norman Lockyer, the founding editor of the journal Nature, created the museum by blending two collections. One collection represented pure science. These were instruments involved in the metrics and the measurement of the world. But Lockyer wanted a little bit more than that. He realized that the application of science was changing society. So he added the collections of the Patent Office. Now, I don't want to explore the complex relationship between basic science, innovation, engineering, and so on, which is a rich and very, very divisive and well-trodden subject. All I want to say is that Lockyer realized that to inspire a general audience, he needed to connect basic science with everyday concerns. He was, in effect, telling the public, these objects are heroes. He was using them to show their amazing impact on everyday life. By linking these collections, he wanted to tell a simple story. Apply science, change the world. This story of heroic objects does unfortunately have one legacy. Politicians still place endless emphasis on how there's an umbilical between the mother lode of scientific research and all those practical newborn babies that the government will one day tax. Still, I think Lockyer was really onto something. The point of science museums is really not to educate, it's to inspire. And when it comes to the public, few things inspire more than the appliance of science. Now, there's another way that science is inspirational, albeit to a much more specialist audience. There are mathematical heroes too. These heroes deepen understanding. They change the way that we view the world. They're potent ways to organize our thoughts so that we can not only make sense of the universe, we can actually make predictions about it too. They tell a story about the workings of the universe, just as a conventional hero tells a story about the human spirit. And for me, great equations are just as rich a stimulus as poetry to the imagination. General relativity tells a story of how gravity warps space and time, of black holes and gravity waves, and the large-scale structure of the universe. In it, Einstein had used a handful of principles to blend fundamental concepts that until he had come along had been thought to be independent. You had space and time on one hand, and you had matter and motion on the other. Einstein had palpitations on glimpsing his new theory and felt as if something inside him had snapped. He said, "I was beside myself with ecstasy for days." Now, surely that makes these heroic equations as inspiring as any Hockney. Schrödinger's wave equation tells the story of how the quantum state of a physical system, from atoms to the universe itself, changes with time. So it's a foundation stone of modern physics. But the equation actually also tells another story, a very human story of Schrödinger's stay in an alpine resort in Arosa, where he was inspired to devise the equation by a fling with an old girlfriend. Now, we still don't know who, the identity of that woman. So the wave equation to me is a story of nature, and it's also an inspiring story of how passion can drive us all to new creative heights. And that brings me to Paul Dirac and his equation, the first theory to fully account for relativity in the context of quantum mechanics. This marries the great theories to give a description of the electron, why it's got spin, and so on. This little hero describes every electron in the past and every electron in the future. This equation also implied the existence of antimatter, a new form of matter, even before it was experimentally verified and discovered. So this equation, which I think is one of the supreme achievements of modern science, also tells us how much Dirac valued beauty. At a seminar in Moscow in 1956, he scribbled on the blackboard in capital letters, "Physical laws should have mathematical beauty. Ugly is wrong." And this heroic equation is actually the only equation you can find in Westminster Abbey. And it tells us that aesthetics of a cosmic kind are just as important in science as in the arts. Now, of course, if we've got heroes, there have to be villains. Villains and their stories, I think, also illuminate and tell a general audience how science is done. So there's the story of Pons, Fleischmann, and cold fusion. Got a confession, I used to work in Fleischmann's laboratory, not directly under him, but in one of the labs in Southampton. And I really don't think he set out to deceive. I think his story is a really interesting cautionary tale of what happens when one tribe of science, the electrochemists, failed to understand the language, the culture, and the traditions and rituals of another tribe, the nuclear physicists. It's also an example of what Irving Langmuir called pathological science, by which people are tricked into false results by subjective effects, wishful thinking, or threshold interactions. There's Hwang WooSuk, the cloner. Now, in 2005, and I was there in Seattle when he made the announcement, he made headlines when he claimed that his team had cloned human embryonic stem cells, paving a way to a revolution in regenerative medicine. Now they were a fabrication. But there's kind of an interesting backstory to this. It turns out that some of his lines had come from a parthenote. That's an activated and unfertilized egg. His team also did clone Snuppy the dog. And one of my co-authors, Ian Wilmot, tells me that was actually a tough thing to do at the time because the reproductive cycle of the dog was really not very well understood. So here you've got a kind of talented villain in some ways. He could advance science, and his team really could deliver some things, but he clearly became impatient when his experiments lagged behind the huge expectations of him and his research, particularly in his country. And then, of course, you've got the usual suspects. You've got the homeopaths, the crop circle experts, the astrologers, and other purveyors of complete mind rot. Now, sadly, the existence of cranks is perhaps the price I think we have to pay for surrendering to the incredible power of the story to make sense of our lives, even if a particular story makes no sense whatsoever. But even here, I think there's a redeeming feature of this, in that these villains do provide a distorted mirror through which to view the need for randomized control trials, for statistics, and for theories based on known physical laws, and so on. So let me sum up now. Scientific heroes are the genes of science, and some of them are pretty selfish too. but the stories of their heroics carry the values of science much more potently than anything else. The point is that they work as viral transmitters of science in the crowded realm of ideas. Now, we don't want to cling on to false myths, and I'm really not saying that. The big issue for me is not whether we should have heroes. Of course we should have heroes, but we have to ensure that they tell a reasonably truthful story about science. So I hear you ask, right, who or what is the ultimate scientific hero? Well, I could cheat. Oh, I've lost him. I did have a picture of Hero of Alexandria, the 1st century BCE Greek mathematician and engineer from Alexandria who came up with the pioneering steam-powered device. I'm actually joking there. Of course, he was Hero, but he was a long way from giving us a steam age. I think actually the ultimate hero of science can be found here in this building. Historians of science rightly remind us that we need to be skeptical about scientific heroes. But the ultimate scientific hero, I think, is skepticism. And it's great to be able to say that in the Royal Society because that's the gist of its motto. So I look forward to a future where skepticism is a popular hero and quackery is no more. And although I respect the views of the historians, just remember that if we're going to be skeptical about heroes, we're going to have to be skeptical about skepticism as well. Now, the scientific method has changed life, it's changed culture, it's changed everything. It's set the stage for a reassessment of our place in the universe. It's the mother of all invention. Its impact on everyday life is ubiquitous and indisputable, even though a surprising number of people, including a good many politicians, have only the most feeble, tenuous grasp of its significance. For me, the scientific culture of skepticism, testing, and provisional consensus forming is the most significant achievement of our species. And I think that if democracy is going to work, we need as many people as possible to understand this and just to know what science is about. That's why, ultimately, we need scientific heroes. We need heroes because we need science. Thank you very much.
Great. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we still have a quarter of an hour, and it is your turn to work. We expect some questions from you, and because it's being broadcast, we need a microphone. So there's a gentleman there with the black. So, if you wish, it's not essential.
Apologies, because I'm going to be an enormous skeptic here about what some of the things you've said. I was going to ask an innocuous... Pardon?
Are you a historian of science?
No, I'm a theoretical physicist.
Oh, okay, fine.
So the big... I'm going to... I suppose this is a huge party pooper. What I'm going to say is that the story of the Higgs boson and there being this mysterious Higgs field is the most spectacular own goal in the history of science. So I can hear you all. And you don't need to delve into the mathematical intricacies of quantum field theory to tell you that. You can do it in two ways. And the first way is what you said. We should always be aware of what the history of science tells us. It stops us going off track. And so the origin of mass as the self-energy of the electron came from quantum electrodynamics 60 years ago. It's electromagnetic energy. So that's the first thing.
So that's a splendid point. Can you get to your question? I'm intrigued.
No.
I'm intrigued by your holding an orange.
Oh, yes. I don't want to make this.
Yes, don't throw it at me, please.
No, this is the most intriguing bit.
Right.
Which common sense will tell you why the Higgs boson is rubbish. This is an orange. It has mass, right? You can make it change colour, you can squeeze it or anything, but it always has mass. but it also has another property. It's got a gravitational field. And you can't detach these two things, mass, gravity.
So we're saying the orange should be the hero and not the... Where's the heroic angle? Okay.
Yes. But the question, yes.
Yeah, well, the question comes at the end. So the question is, so if you have mass and gravity, if you have a fundamental theory of mass, then it must also be a fundamental theory of gravity. That's just absolute infallible.
But the standard model doesn't have gravity in it, of course.
No,
yeah.
That's why it's completely wrong.
Right.
It's just quantum field theory.
But it's not about heroes, though, right?
So my question is this. You know,
okay.
As a scientific journalist, as a man who knows, how can it be that we've all been deluded?
Well, maybe that heroic tale. I mean, I'll be interested to see what the writing of that tale will be in 50 years' time. I still think we're...
you have to wait to find
those confidence, those 5 sigma plus results were pretty convincing.
That's nothing to do, that's a bump in the spectrum, but it's explaining what a bump in the spectrum is. That's got, you know, the connection between that bump, what that bump is, it's certainly not Higgs's boson.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm sorry, we really must go on to the next question. The gentleman over there. And please hold on to your orange.
Many thanks, Roger, for a fascinating lecture. One of the psychological theories about why there's a need for heroes in the public, there's a psychological theory that we have a need for an upwardly directed relationship. So when we were children, we had an upwardly directed relationship towards our parents. And there's a scientific theory about why we need religion, why we need God, is we have to have an upwardly directed relationship to someone else as we grow up. So is it the case that maybe the public have this need for an upwardly directed relationship, and that's why they need heroes, but within the world of science, our upwardly directed relationship isn't to a person, but to a method, to the scientific method, to this systematic attempt to detect error in our ideas, and that's why science is fundamentally suspicious of this upwardly directed relationship that the public needs. And that's a fundamental tension that I know you're trying to address tonight, but maybe it's an irreconcilable tension.
I see where you're coming from, but I still feel that, you know, I'm just trying to make quite a simple point here, that I think this is the currency which a very general audience, and I'm not talking about the people who watch Horizon, I'm talking about the people who watch The X Factor. That's what they're looking for. And even if we in science abandoned Nobel Prizes, we abandoned medals, we abandoned any way to say this person or this woman did better than the other people, you would still find that the public would create a heroic story out of whatever information was out there. So I guess what I'm looking at a slightly different way. I'm just saying that these are the viral ideas that people are receptive to. You might as well go with the flow and just make sure that when we do make someone heroic, and I think if you look at what Einstein did, surely that's a heroic story, you know, almost apart from the scientific establishment. You had Besso, you had the Olympia Academy, you had a Mileva Maric, but really doing his own thing. It's amazing. It's truly amazing. We should celebrate them and just make sure that they've got a certain amount of truthfulness in them so we can look the public in the eye. It's a bit like writing a headline for a story or something. You're just trying to convey the gist with a hero story.
So, Uta, yeah.
I hope I got that bit of neuroscience right, Uta.
Of course, I really liked your lecture. And I'm suggesting that perhaps there are some other hidden heroes that you didn't mention. Could they be science writers?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on that. You may say that, but...
so just like John.
Yes, I enjoyed your lecture very much. Your take on heroes was that they were, as you presented them, slightly passive figures which were used as vehicles for journalists such as yourself to inspire the public. But to what extent would you like to allow them to take on lives of their own and start telling us what to do and so on and so forth? They have a more active role. Do you think heroes should be leaders as well?
I think they end up being leaders. I mean, if you look at what happened, I remember one You know, when I went to the Einstein archive in Boston University, when he got into his 50s, when he seemed to transcend being a normal human being into a kind of omniscient being, an authority on everything, there were just thousands and thousands of letters from people all over the world asking Einstein's advice. You know, even a little letter, I think, from a 3-year-old girl saying, "Do you exist?" You know, it went right from there to how to guarantee world peace. So I think actually with the hero, you do end up with an authority figure as well, and that certainly happened in Einstein's case.
So there's a gentleman here and then a lady on the aisle on the other side.
I think you copped out slightly at the end. You haven't actually told us who your, what we're saying, skepticism is your hero, but who's your personal hero? You've mentioned Einstein a few times. Is he your personal hero?
I think Einstein, for me, ticks a lot of boxes. I think he's amazing. The only thing that drives me nuts about the popular depiction of Einstein is it's fixated on his Princeton years, when really, you know, to be a bit cruel, he wasn't part of the conversation then. And if you focused on Einstein during his Annus Mirabilis, 1905, around then, you've got someone who plays jokes on his friends, who plays a violin, who's good-looking, is chasing women around and so on, is having a fling with Mileva, has an illegitimate child. You know, you've got a fully rounded. I mean, when we revealed this, no, but you've got a recognizable human being here, yeah. You know, and he's a very attractive, likable, funny person, and I'd love to get the story. I wish those Einstein biopics would make it through the Hollywood commissioning process, even if it is Walter Isaacson's version of the story. So
I should say that when I was lecturing on quantum mechanics, I showed a picture of Pauli as a baby to show that even scientists were children once. So the lady over there.
Roger, do you think we are getting more cynical and therefore the scientists are going to be found, or the scientist heroes are going to be found to have feet of clay?
Going to be found what, sorry?
To have feet of clay and fail.
Well, I think the reality is that if you think the public are totally naive, I don't think the public really buy into the hero myths either. They know that behind a story of apparent heroics, there's usually something a bit more complicated going on. You know, I think with Einstein there was a particular problem because what you found was that the correspondence about the young Einstein was only really revealed in the the mid-'80s, I think, and that's what I popularized with Paul Carter. And before that, popular biographies of Einstein had just glossed over his early interesting years. And there were almost Einstein priests out there among scholars protecting his reputation, who didn't want the stories of his flings and his slightly more adventurous side in Berlin to come out and so on. So I think actually most, you know, scientists are human beings, shock horror. I think most people expect scientists to have feet of clay, with the exception of maybe Tim Hunt and, you know, Roger Pendry and, John Pendry and so on. So there we are.
So can I ask you very quickly, are there, all the people that you describe as heroes have sort of really survived, even like Newton from a long time ago, are there any sort of temporary heroes who become really famous for a bit and then their myth isn't quite up to standard and they sort of disappear again?
Well, I think there are, and actually some of them rather depress me in a sense. You know, if you look at Faraday, for example, I mean, here's someone who was celebrated, I seem to remember, with an exhibition in the Albert Hall, and the Prime Minister turned up, and it was the father of the electrical revolution. And I know the Royal Institution and Frank James are still doggedly telling us that Faraday was a huge character, but he doesn't seem to have the purchase in popular consciousness that he really deserves. He was amazing, Faraday. And there are many more. James Clerk Maxwell, I think, as well.
So, lady over there.
I thought I would just pick up, Roger, on that point you made about Faraday. I wondered whether is it possible that some become heroes more than others because of some bizarre quirk, like you're not wearing socks or something. You know, if there's something ridiculous somehow that people can latch onto that's memorable. I mean, maybe Faraday shouldn't have worn socks, for example. Would that have helped the longevity of his reputation? I don't know. I just would be interested to know what you think about that.
I think that iconic Einstein image with his tongue sticking out, that's like a sort of worm that inserted itself in, you know, if ever you talk about scientists and you ask someone, okay, what's a picture of a scientist you can remember? That leaps into people's heads. You're absolutely right, in his Princeton years, not wearing socks is another example. I seem to remember he used to comfort his sister, a vegetarian, by declaring that hot dogs were honorary vegetables. You know, lots of kind of fun Einstein stories. And Graham Farmlow's done a brilliant job with Dirac stories as well, which again are kind of, you know, mind-boggling. You know, the guy who goes on about, you know, blah, 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 Professor Dirac, and then Dirac just says nothing for 5 minutes and says that wasn't a question. That was prompted, and says not a question, that was a statement. You don't understand, in effect, what I'm talking about. You know, these are absolute gold dust, and I think people do latch on to eccentricities. And, you know, for example, I remember going to one of the Human Genome press conferences, and I had a chat with a very affable bloke at the back of the auditorium in the welcome. A lovely man, seemed to know an awful lot about it. And someone said to me afterwards, that was Fred Sanger you're talking to. And I really wish Fred Sanger had not been wearing shoes, had a shock of wild hair, you know, maybe a big dribble of egg yolk down his tie, some clues that there was some... Anyway, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So I think that's a good place to end. So you need to move slightly or you will not get your prize. So it comes in 3 parts: your medal.
Thank you very much.
Your scroll.
Gosh.
And your envelope.
So who's the winner?
And so can I ask you all to join me in thanking Roger for a wonderful lecture?
Thank you.